Thank you very much, Corinna. Thank you very much for inviting me, for your kind introduction. Paul, thank you also for those very interesting remarks and for the kind things that you said. I'm going to try and touch on the themes that you've addressed. Obviously didn't know what you were going to say before you said it, but I'm also going to try and answer my question, is authoritarianism in retreat? And I'm going to give you three answers to this question, because I think the answer very much depends on how you assess the relative strength of authoritarian and democratic politics. There are three ways, I think, primary ways that you might do that, that we might do that. And they each give a different answer to the question. So the first, and they're all in their way familiar, is to try and map the relative strength of authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes. So there are lots of organizations, including universities, that try to do this, that produce indices and charts that try to tell you at a basic level, are there more or fewer democracies than there used to be, more or fewer authoritarian regimes than there used to be, how many people live under these different systems, and which one is growing and which one is shrinking. So I'm just going to take one of those indices, which is it's a widely respected one. I think it's useful. They publish it every year. The Economist magazine does a democracy index. And the democracy index published this year for last year, so the democracy index 2022, gives an answer to this question. Is authoritarianism in retreat? So the Economist divides the world up into four regime types: what it calls full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrid regimes. So hybrid regimes are countries that tend to have elections, and these elections are in some sense competitive, but often have a very attenuated form of the rule of law, or often highly corrupt, very limited freedom of the press, and so on. And then finally, authoritarian regimes. So of those four systems of government, the largest number of individuals in the world, just by a very small margin, live in flawed democracies. That's partly because The Economist counts the United States of America as a flawed democracy. It does not fit in the top group. By far the smallest number of people live in full democracies. 8% of the global population. There are, I think, in The Economist list, only 22 full democracies. It does not include the United States of America. It does include Germany, does include the United Kingdom, though they are not in the top rank. The United Kingdom and Germany are both quite a long way behind, for instance, the Republic of Ireland, New Zealand, and the country that's always number one in every survey of everything, Norway. The largest number of nations are the authoritarian regimes. But what really stands out when you look at the map is that it is pretty much a four-way split. And the answer that The Economist gives this year to the question of what is rising and what is falling is that the picture is static. It's not unchanging, but for now anyway, it looks quite fixed. There are quite a lot of authoritarian regimes, quite a lot of hybrid regimes, quite a lot of flawed democracies, quite a lot of full democracies. Some countries move between different categories, but not many do. This is not like the Cold War. This is not a split between two ideologies, a democratic world and an authoritarian world. This is a patchwork of different regime types. It's very hard to detect a single pattern, and it is changing all the time. So it is both static, but also it is not rigid. Just this week, I was reading about El Salvador, a country that rarely features in arguments about the state of democracy. It was an article in the New York Times saying that El Salvador is potentially a bellwether for a significant shift in people's understanding of democracy in Central America and perhaps more widely, because the current El Salvadorian government has been extraordinarily successful at repressing gang violence in El Salvador. El Salvador is now a much less violent, much more peaceful country than it was even a year ago, and it has been achieved by steamrolling the rule of law, by abandoning ideas of civil liberties. And the New York Times version of this story is that the El Salvador success story is potentially the most dangerous recent development for democratic politics in the region, because it looks like a model for giving people what they want, which is the end of violence. In the name of the state and the rule of law is being repressed. This is a fast-moving picture, but if you try and map the state of democracy, the answer to the question is that authoritarianism is neither in retreat nor in advance. We're looking at a patchwork world in which there are shifts, but this is a four-way split, and nothing is going to be resolved anytime soon. Is that optimistic? Is that pessimistic? Is it realistic? It's realistic. There is not a great wave of democratization, nor are we in the democratic recession that was talked about in the 2000s and 2010s. We're in a world where everything is to play for, but nothing is currently moving decisively one way or the other. In some respects, this is more optimistic than the picture looked maybe 10 years ago. You know, it's all relative, but it's complicated. The second way that one might try to answer the question is not to map or index the state of democracy, but to ask the question, what happens when democratic forms of politics come into direct competition with more authoritarian forms of politics, where there is a contest and we're able to use the language of winners and losers? That tends to be the other way in which people try to assess the strength of democracy. There, I would say, and Paul touched on this, Corinna touched on this, the story of the last few years is positive. If you want to find evidence for authoritarianism being in retreat relative to what was being discussed 5, 6, 7 years ago, when there was a widespread discourse of a crisis of democracy, usually framed in the language of a populist wave, the picture looks, if you believe in liberal democratic values, rosier now, because the Democrats are winning. They are winning at the ballot box relative to a few years ago. So the poster boy for the anxiety about the crisis of democracy was Donald Trump. And there was a lot of writing, and my book, How Democracy Ends, was partly a response to this. So my book, Democracy Ends, begins by saying Donald Trump is not how democracy ends, in contrast to the books that say Donald Trump is the end of democracy, of which there were many. Donald Trump was not the end of democracy, but at the time there was a strong sense that he represented the authoritarian populist streak in Western democratic politics, and it was growing in strength, and it was winning. And Donald Trump is unquestionably, instinctively, an authoritarian politician. So I remember in the first presidential debate in 2016, which I watched live, it was a traumatic experience for anyone who was particularly watching it at 2 a.m. At the end of that debate, I remember thinking, well, that man is never going to be president of the United States. So I know nothing. But I do distinctly remember 2 things that he said in that debate. The first was he was asked, what would you do if you were president? And he said, pointing at Hillary Clinton, she would be in jail. Now that is quintessentially an authoritarian reflex. If I win, I will jail my opponents. And the second thing he was asked was, will you respect the result of the election? And he said, well, that depends if I win it or not. And that is also a quintessentially authoritarian reflex. Elections are good if I win them. If I don't, they're not. He became president. Hillary Clinton did not go to jail. If anyone is going to jail, it is Donald Trump. He lost in 2020. He clearly lost. He denied the result of the election. He said it doesn't count as a defeat. I won it. He told his supporters that he won it. Many of his supporters believe that he won it. He is not president of the United States. The winner of that election is president of the United States. Joe Biden's presidency, if we didn't know what came before it, looks like a very conventional American presidency. Almost nothing about it is out of the norm. What are called the guardrails of American politics seem to have held. Donald Trump is still shaking them, but as things stand now, American democracy has restored its institutional coherence. If you didn't know about the Trump years and you were just presented with American politics now, you would think, as at any point in America's history, some of it looks a bit weird, but it's pretty robust and it's familiar. I mean, apart from his age, Joe Biden is a very familiar kind of American politician. And it's not just Trump who lost. Bolsonaro lost. There was a lot of anxiety that Macron would lose to Marine Le Pen. Macron comfortably defeated Marine Le Pen. Macron is now facing a crisis in France, but it is a familiar, recognizable democratic crisis. It's the kind of democratic politics that anyone who thinks about democracy thinks is part of what we mean by democracy. The fact that the president of France is facing serious difficulty in passing legislation that he's done as a kind of emergency. What would you expect? This isn't evidence of a crisis of democracy. The Democrats have been winning at the ballot box, and democracy looks in relatively good health. Certainly better health in those terms than it did 5 or 6 years ago. Even in Britain, where I think mistakenly Brexit and Trump were kind of run together as evidence of this sort of rising populist wave that was going to make democratic politics impossible. In Britain in 2019, we had a general election where the two possible candidates for Prime Minister were Boris Johnson, who I don't think is a Trumpian authoritarian, but he has a loose relationship to the norms of democratic politics, and Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, who in his own mind is the best kind of Democrat, but would have been an unusual person to end up as Prime Minister of a major democratic state. Now we have as the leaders of the two main parties in Britain, two completely conventional, utterly centrist, deeply boring managerial politicians. I mean, in a way, that can also produce a crisis of democracy because people are not particularly engaged by what's going on. But relative to what we were presented with a few years ago, British democracy, for better or for worse, is reverting to type. So if the test is the ballot box, the fears of 3, 4, 5 years ago look to me, at any rate, to be vastly overblown. There are still some very successful, electorally successful, authoritarian democratic politicians in the world, of whom Modi is the prime example. But nonetheless, overall, I think the picture looks healthy. What's the second kind of contest that there might be between democratic politics and authoritarian politics? War, in some ways the ultimate contest. Sometimes democracies fight the other kind of regime. There is a war going on in Europe which has become a kind of model, for some people anyway, of the defense of democracy, which is Ukraine, against what is clearly a highly authoritarian form of politics, Putinism. And when that war began, there was a fear that the democratic regime would be overwhelmed. Now, as I say this and I call Ukraine a democratic regime, it is worth remembering, even if you look at the Economist's index of democracies, Ukraine does not rank high, right? Ukraine is a hybrid regime. I mean, for Ukraine to become the kind of flagship model of the defense of democracy, before the war, Ukraine was a highly oligarchic, highly corrupt, hybrid form of electoral political system, led by a clown. I mean, you listed the clowns. Zelensky was the only one of them who really still, until relatively recently, was a professional comedian. More comedian than, many. More comedian than Boris Johnson. More comedian than Donald Trump. Funnier. But Ukraine has now become the front line of what looks like a contest which, relative to what people thought would happen at the start of the war, is going, if not well for democracy, badly for the authoritarian regime. And many of the traditional weaknesses of authoritarian politics are being exposed. The inefficiency, the highly centralized command and control structures, the difficulty of bad news reaching the people at the top, the inflexibility, the tendency to dig in when things are going badly, the use of repressive techniques back at home to maintain morale. The Russian regime is behaving in all of the relatively weak ways that one expects of authoritarian regimes under strain. The surprise, in a way, is that the Ukrainian regime is holding up. Now, the war is not resolved. Many, many different things could happen. But again, relative to even a year ago, if this is being held up as the test, here is an authoritarian regime in direct confrontation with what we are now wanting to call a democratic regime. it's not clear that authoritarianism is winning. And it may be the case that authoritarianism is losing. And then finally, the third contest, which in a way is the surprising one, in which I think many people's views have been turned on their head, is COVID, the crisis that we've just come through. Maybe a year into the COVID pandemic, there was a relatively widespread body of commentary and opinion that said that the pandemic was revealing some of the strengths of more autocratic or authoritarian political systems, with the focus particularly on China. The United States was failing badly. Many, many, many more people were getting sick and dying, and not just in the United States, but in other liberal democratic regimes, the full democracies, as well as the flawed democracies, relative to what seemed to be happening, not just in China, in places like Vietnam too, but China became the kind of flagship model of this, that under these kinds of conditions, the ability to corral and to control a population, which is what the democratic regimes were trying to do. In the Economist Index, authoritarianism rose during the years of the pandemic, not because the authoritarian regimes became more authoritarian, but because the full democracies were starting to do things that were associated with authoritarian regimes, including, in certain circumstances, suspending bits of the rule of law. You will have read it, I read it, that the pandemic was showing the strengths of the Chinese political system. That doesn't look true today. Not just because the democracies came out of COVID intact, which they have. I mean, there may still be all sorts of long-term effects that we don't know anything about. No political society goes through experiences like that without it leaving profound scars. But for now, at least, the democracies are intact. And the biggest mistake seems to be the one that was made by the Chinese regime. Zero COVID, which was held up for a long time in the West as an example of what could be achieved by a certain kind of ruthlessness. And I remember hearing from an Italian doctor not that long after the start of the pandemic when the virus arrived in Italy, and Chinese experts were sent to Italy to advise the Italians on how to do a lockdown. And the Italian said, right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And their Chinese advisors said to them, that's not a lockdown. That's vaguely curtailing people's freedoms. A lockdown is what we did in Wuhan. You lock people down. You barricade them in their homes. You fence off the city so that no one can get in and get out. You allow people to die, small numbers of people to die, in order to protect the wider population. What you are doing in Italy is nothing like a lockdown, to which the Italians said, well, we can't do that. And we couldn't do that. But nonetheless, what happened in China in the end was unsustainable. What we did was sustainable. What happened in China wasn't sustainable. In the end, the zero COVID policy failed. The Chinese regime faced the most serious public and political discontent that it has since Tiananmen. It had to reverse a policy it said it wouldn't reverse. And we don't know how bad it has been subsequently, because the other thing about those kinds of regimes is that they don't tell you the bad news. I don't think anyone knows exactly how many people have died in China. I don't think anyone knows what the long-term consequences are of the recent decisions of the Chinese government. But it is much, much, much less common now to hear people say, the thing about COVID is it shows the strength of authoritarian politics. It doesn't. People are much more likely to think, we came up with the vaccines, we got through it, our institutions and our political systems are intact, though we curtailed the rule of law in certain specific cases. Broadly, we came through it with our values intact too. We lost a lot of lives, but China has now lost a lot of lives as well. Elections, war, COVID, the score sheet from the last 3, 4, 5 years is good for democracy. And now I want to offer 2 reasons to be pessimistic, because I think that is not even close to the whole story. So the first reason to be pessimistic, I'll leave aside the pandemic, because the pandemic in many ways it was and is a one-off. It's hard to find things to compare it to, although there may be more pandemics to come. But elections and wars as snapshots of the relative strength of democratic as opposed to rival forms of politics are very bad guides. This is one of the things that history teaches us. So Paul was saying that there is a renewed interest in elections, which there is, and particularly a renewed interest in the light of the attempt by some politicians to deny the importance of elections. That said, however, I also think it's true in most, if not all, Western democracies that there is an unhealthy fixation on elections, not because elections aren't an important part of democratic politics. They are completely crucial. They are not as sufficient, but they absolutely are a necessary condition. You don't even get to be a hybrid regime without elections. But elections are so often taken as a marker of where we are, what we've achieved, and what's coming next. We look to elections to tell us not just the health of our democracy, but where we are in whatever story it is that we're telling. And elections are a terrible guide to that. They almost never tell you where things are heading and what's happening. We think of them as the points that punctuate our democratic politics that are a kind of weighing up of the evidence. And so we now discover Trump won, Trump lost. Trump won, we're on the road to fascism. Trump lost, we've been saved. And if you look at it in a broader sweep, elections are almost always, not always, but almost always incidental or secondary to what's really going on. So just to give a couple of examples from the United States. So the election, which at the time was treated as the real marker of change, this was the election that produced, including, I remember it well, in this country, a huge outpouring of hope and optimism that something not just symbolic but substantial had shifted in the nature of democracy was the election of Barack Obama in 2008. That was the election that symbolized and was going to mean in practice a fundamental shift to a new and potentially better kind of politics. It didn't. It changed nothing because Obama was a continuity candidate. If ever there was a continuity candidate in American politics, it's Barack Obama. Barack Obama talked the talk of change. He was not a change politician. He symbolized change in his person, but symbolism does not tell you which way history is going. Donald Trump, 8 years later, was the politician that spelled doom for democracy, calamity for democracy. If the man who says he's going to jail his opponents gets elected president of the United States, we're all finished. But he didn't jail his opponents because he had no idea how to jail his opponents. Because Obama, with hindsight, was the continuity candidate, and Trump, with hindsight, was the incompetence candidate. Trump didn't know how to do politics. He didn't know how to get things done. The signal achievements of his presidency, certainly for his supporters, were the conventional, competent things that he didn't really do, were mainly done for him by Mitch McConnell, including getting 3 justices on the US Supreme Court. But the justices he got on the US Supreme Court were not Trumpian justices. They were conventional Republican lawyers. Elections are a terrible guide to the direction of travel if you step back more than 6 months a year and start looking in 5-year, 10-year, or longer timeframes. But so also, I think, probably is war. So war looks like it should be the ultimate way of testing who's winning and who's losing. If the democracy wins the war, then democracy has won. And particularly if it's a war that's being fought in the name of democracy, as the Ukraine war now is. It has become, by proxy, through the rhetoric of politicians in the West, a war that has to be fought and won for the sake of democracy, our values, an idea of Europe, a certain conception of freedom, and so on. And many politicians, not all, but many politicians have drawn quite clear red lines what it would mean for democracy for that war to go the wrong way. So victory in that war means that democracy is on the advance and authoritarianism is in retreat. But history does not suggest that that is the way to judge these things. And I'll just give you 2 examples, the 2 biggest examples. The 2 great wars of the 20th century. The First World War was a war fought for democracy, at the end of which democracy was said to have won. And that war was a catastrophe for democracy. And the victory of democracy in that war turned out to be an illusion. The Second World War was not a war fought for democracy. It was not a war that democracy could be said to have won, because it was won in part by Stalinism. No one at the end of that war could say that this was a triumph for democracy. But that was the war, not the clear victory for democracy war, but the pragmatic, compromised, hybrid war. That was the one that secured democracy for the second half of the 20th century. It is perfectly possible to imagine a victory for democracy in Ukraine that turns out to be a disaster for democracy. I'm not saying that's what will happen, but I'm saying it's a real possibility. It's also possible to imagine a hybrid, compromised, pragmatic outcome of that war, which is in the end the thing that secures democratic freedom and survival. It's a terrible idea to think that military victory translates into democratic success. And then the second reason for pessimism. And let me just talk for 10 more minutes, would that be okay? So I think it's also possible to look at this in a much longer term perspective. That is to ask a question not about ballot boxes and military conflict and about who's up and who's down, who's winning, who's losing, which regime type is on the march, but to frame it more in the terms that Corinna did at the beginning. We are looking at long-term challenges that will have profound effects on all of our lives over a generation. So not the crisis as such, but something more like the ongoing emergency. And I want to highlight two. And if you look at these two challenges in particular, I think there is reason to be doubtful, and this is the thing I'm most pessimistic about, that they favor liberal democratic politics. So the two that I want to discuss are the impact of digital technology on all of our lives, including the recent burst of AI excitement, and climate change. So with digital technology, we have seen a reversal, similar, though over a longer time period, to the reversal that came out of the COVID pandemic. COVID was thought that it was going to be good for the authoritarians, turned out to be less good for the authoritarians. We all remember that the digital revolution was going to be great for democracy. Right? That was the rhetoric through the 1990s, even through the 2000s, that this has to favor democratic regimes and it has to be bad for authoritarians because this is open, this is about freedom of information, this makes it harder to keep secrets, all of the things that authoritarian regimes need to do: control information, keep secrets, control the way that people behave. This technology surely is going to make that much, much harder. It empowers citizens. Citizens can find out all sorts of things about the people that rule them. Citizens can find out the information they need to take informed decisions, to govern themselves. All of the optimism around this technology pointed for a long time in favor of democracy. And it was thought that it would just be a matter of time before authoritarian regimes were opened up by this technology. Their citizens would no longer be willing to put up with this kind of control because they would have in their pockets, in their hands, on their desktops, the means to expose the people who were trying to rule them without democratic accountability. And that turned out to be the great illusion of our time. This technology, for now at least, suits authoritarian regimes just fine. Why? I mean, it's a complicated question. I'm going to give you a 3-line answer. I think one way to frame this is that description of this technology, that it opens things up and it allows citizens the ability to inquire and inform themselves and to monitor and keep an eye on the people who govern them. It's a question of resources, right? You have to have the time to do that. You have to be able to organize yourselves to do that. To do that to scale is really hard work. And very few of us, either individually or collectively, have those resources. What seems to have happened is that in the contest of them watching us and us watching them, this technology has fragmented our attention and it's coalesced theirs. So of course authoritarian states have the resources to do this. It's what they do. It's like their job, right? They observe, they study, they collate, they control. We don't do that. This technology, it seems to me, was always likely to favor the individuals, the organizations, the institutions that have the resource capacity to deploy it permanently and to scale. And the institution that is best equipped to do that is the authoritarian state. It is the Leviathan. It is the panopticon. The panopticon, the machine that never sleeps. We sleep, we lose interest, our attention is getting shorter, our attention span is getting shorter and shorter. The attention span of the authoritarian regimes is not getting shorter and shorter. It's what it always was, fixed on us. It was an illusion to think that open information would favor individuals over authoritarian institutions. The second reason, I think, to be wary is that innovation in digital technology, fundamental innovation in digital technology, still seems to be driven by the imperatives of militarized politics, in the sense that the private sector, free markets, corporations do the fine-tuning of this technology, turn it into products that they can sell to us that we can use, products that they can use to monitor us and sell our data, advertise to us, all of the stuff that we associate with the digital revolution. But the underlying foundation of the digital revolution is the spending of the American military-industrial establishment during the Cold War, driven by Cold War paranoia. And now we're in the early stages of another version of a Cold War, and the same scenario is likely to be repeating itself, that some of the fundamental innovative shifts that are happening are being driven by more authoritarian forms of politics. Huge amounts of spending in China on AI for military purposes, fear and paranoia in the United States. Why does the American federal government not regulate the big technology corporations, given the harm that they're doing to all of our lives? Because it doesn't dare, because it's been persuaded that if it does that, it will lose the AI arms race to China, because that's where it thinks the innovation now is going to have to come from. If that is true, then this technology and the next phase of innovation is going to be driven by more authoritarian forms of politics. And finally, in some ways the biggest disappointment of all, this technology was meant to democratize not just political life, but everyday life. So for instance, in that euphoric phase, that utopian phase, there was a belief, a hope, that it was going to democratize our workplaces. You know, we'd be able to keep an eye on our bosses. We would have a much better idea of how the organizations that we work for run. They would be open. They would share information with us. Now, I can only speak for myself. I work in a university, so you may all have different experiences than I do. But does anyone in this room think that the organization that they work for has been democratized by this technology, rather than becoming harder, more frustrating to access, more opaque, more difficult to understand, more burdensome, in many ways less free? It's not the end of the story, but if the hope was that this would be the way that institutions, organizations, structures outside of political life would be returned to the people who worked for them, it hasn't happened yet. And it's most obviously the case in the most powerful technology corporations of all, which are run like dictatorships. I mean, what is Elon Musk at Twitter, if not, I mean, dictator even seems too tame. He's like a pharaoh. What he says, what he does, is what happens. I only know one person who worked close to the highest levels at Facebook. It was then called Facebook, it's now called Meta, when it was called Facebook. And he told me that there are only two basic rules that you need to know if you're doing something at Facebook, which will tell you whether your idea will gain traction in the organization or not. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, will it result in people spending more hours on the network? Whatever it is you propose, first test is, will it mean that people spend more time on Facebook? Because the goal of the organization was to close off the exits. They wanted to make sure that people who, once they were on the network, had no way out. And then the second question was, will Mark like it? There was no third question. This technology, long-term, does not look to me like it favors democracy. Finally, briefly, climate, so that we have time for Q&A. The biggest challenge of our time of all, perhaps, is climate change. We've been told to think about the possibility of feedback loops in the ecosystem, the ways in which some things might happen that have knock-on effects that we haven't anticipated, that rapidly accelerate the damage or the harm that's being done. But the same has to be true of the impact and relationship between a changing climate and a changing politics. A changing climate will have effects on our politics, and the effects on our politics will produce feedback loops that impact both back on our ability to handle the climate change that we're confronting, but also on our ability to adapt our politics to the challenges that we face. Who knows what climate change will bring, but there are some things that seem pretty likely. One, more migration. That seems almost certainly to be one of the effects that we should anticipate. And large-scale, mass, uncontrolled migration does not favor democracy. It favors authoritarian impulses in democratic regimes. Secondly, more conflict seems likely. Now, conflict is sometimes good for democracy in the way that wars can be good for democracy because they create a sense of solidarity, shared risk, equality of burden. But climate change seems unlikely to do that. It's hard to imagine the scenarios in which climate creates conditions in which our experience of it is equalizing rather than fundamentally inegalitarian. Different parts of the world will have completely different experiences. Different parts of different nations will have different experiences. Even the COVID pandemic was broadly, I think, good for democracy because it was an equalizer. Climate is very unlikely to be an equalizer. And finally, this is the last thing that I'll say. The big fault line in democratic politics at the moment is generational. It's the young and the old. It's sometimes described as being educational, the university, the graduate classes and the rest. These two categories map onto each other quite closely because the older someone is in Western societies, the much less likely it is that that person went to university. But you can see it across all democratic politics, a fundamental division that's opening up between younger voters and older voters. One of the consequences of this, because there are more older voters, is that younger voters are getting more and more alienated from democracy. Why are younger people alienated from democracy? Because they keep losing. Not always, and the last 2 or 3 years have shown that other things are possible. But nonetheless, if all the young people turn out to vote and all the old people turn out to vote, the old people win, because there are more of them, because we live in rapidly aging societies. Partly as a result of that, young people vote less and less. In Britain, turnout among the under 25s is hopeless. Turnout among the over 75s is amazing. And if there is one issue on which the young and the old seem to disagree, polling evidence suggests it's climate change. Young people take it much, much more seriously than older voters. But older voters tend to decide the outcome of elections. And it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons that younger voters increasingly express frustration with democratic politics because they can see that their political systems are not taking what they think are long-term decisions about their long-term futures. This sometimes then cashes out as an argument that says, old people don't care about climate change because they're going to be dead before it happens. That's not true. There is no evidence of that, because old people care just as passionately about education as young people, and old people aren't about to go back to school. Old people care passionately about their grandchildren. Of course, older voters care about the future, including the future after they're dead. What older voters do not like is lifestyle change, completely understandably. I'm an old person, and I don't want to have to give up my car. Younger voters are much more comfortable because they have less lived experience that they have to give up. It sounds like a sort of almost trivial point, and it's at the heart of some of the basic tensions in democratic politics. So this is where I will finish. If you look forward not 2 years, not 1 year, 2 years to what might happen in Ukraine, not 2 years to whether Biden will win again or will Trump come back, not 3 years, not 4 years through the electoral cycles, but 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, 30 years ahead. Can you convincingly say that the direction of travel favors democracy over authoritarianism? I'm afraid my feeling is that it doesn't. And that the big reversal that we are now seeing is the shift from what I would have said was true 20 years ago. If you'd asked me then my beliefs about democracy, I would have said authoritarianism might look like it's good in the short run because authoritarians can get things done. Authoritarians can take decisive action. But in the long run, democracy wins, because in the long run, democracies correct the mistakes that they make. In the long run, democracies are more flexible, more adaptable. They don't stick to zero COVID long past the point where it works. Now, if you ask me, I'll say, it looks like in the short run, democracies have the advantages. But in the long run, I'm now worried that authoritarianism wins. Thank you.